When the email came through, the subject line read, "Investigate Jacob Carruthers, a forgotten visionary." I'd heard the name in passing, but I didn't know much beyond his association with African-centered studies. I grabbed my notebook and began jotting questions. Who was this man? Why did his name command reverence in certain circles yet obscurity in others? My first stop was Chicago's Kemetic Institute. The moment I walked in, I felt the weight of history. Walls lined with books on ancient Africa. A portrait of Carruthers gazing down like a watchful ancestor. A librarian greeted me and said, "If you want to know Carruthers, start with Medu Neter, his Bible on African thought." In Dallas, I found myself sitting across from an elderly woman who had grown up with Jacob. "Jimmy, we called him," she said with a wistful smile. "Smart as a whip, but quiet. He saw things differently, even as a kid." She told me how the segregated South had shaped him, a boy determined to break barriers. Houston Tillotson University had kept detailed records. I thumbed through photos and yearbooks, imagining the young Carruthers sitting in the library, devouring texts on politics and philosophy. Professors had left glowing recommendations. "This young man has a fire for justice." I visited a retired activist who remembered Carruthers' college days. He wasn't marching in the streets, but he was asking the tough questions. What happens after we win? What does real liberation look like? He was always thinking bigger. By the time I arrived at Texas Southern University, I knew Carruthers was no ordinary thinker. Here, he completed his first master's degree in government. His thesis explored political systems, but his real interest was freedom, what it meant and how it could be achieved. At the University of Colorado, former classmates described a young man who had begun to see liberation in global terms. He talked a lot about Africa, one peer told me, not just as a place, but as an idea, a source of identity. In Chicago, I uncovered Carruthers' PhD dissertation, an analysis of African nations post-independence. It was meticulous, but something was missing. His critique of Eurocentrism was there, but I sensed he hadn't yet fully embraced his African-centered identity. I sat down with Carruthers' daughter. She described him as a man who balanced fatherhood and scholarship. He was strict but loving. He believed in us knowing who we were, where we came from. Then I found it, the lecture that changed everything. In the 1970s, Carruthers attended a conference on African liberation. A recording revealed his voice, filled with fire. "We must stop looking at Africa through their eyes. We must see Africa as Africans." I retraced his steps to Egypt, where he first connected with the ancient Kemetic worldview. Standing in front of the pyramids, I imagined Carruthers seeing them not as relics, but as symbols of African greatness. Back in Chicago, I interviewed a former colleague at the Kemetic Institute. He didn't just teach history, he made it come alive. He said, "If we don't control our narrative, someone else will." Carruthers' book Medu Neter, Divine Speech, became my next focus. It wasn't just a linguistic study, it was a call to arms. "Language is power," he wrote. "And reclaiming our language is reclaiming ourselves." I attended a symposium where a speaker described Carruthers as a warrior in the intellectual battlefield. I listened, enthralled, as they recounted his fiery critiques of Eurocentric academia. The Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations was more than a scholarly group. It was a movement. Members I interviewed spoke of Carruthers as their North Star, a man who embodied their mission. Reading The Irritated Genie, I realized how Carruthers connected the dots between history and liberation. Haiti wasn't just an event, it was a blueprint for resistance. His book Intellectual Warfare felt like a manifesto. Carruthers wasn't just analyzing history, he was urging readers to fight for it. "We are at war for the minds of our people," he declared. I spoke with a professor who remembered the resistance Carruthers faced. They called him radical, but he wore it as a badge of honor. He wasn't here to please them. He was here to free us. Former students shared stories of his mentorship. One said, "He didn't just teach me history, he taught me to see myself differently." Carruthers' wife revealed the toll his work took. He gave everything to the cause. Sometimes it felt like there was nothing left for him. I returned to Egypt, this time with a group of ASCAC members on a study tour. Their reverence for Carruthers was palpable. "He brought us back home," one said. Not everyone agreed with Carruthers' methods. A historian I interviewed criticized his romanticized view of Africa, but his defenders argued, romantic or not, it was necessary. In his later years, Carruthers battled cancer. A friend described his quiet strength. Even when he was sick, he kept teaching. He couldn't stop. I found a recording of one of his last lectures. His voice was weaker, but his message was strong. "Our ancestors are waiting for us to rise. Archival footage showed mourners gathered in Chicago, celebrating his life with drums, chants, and libations. It wasn't just a goodbye, it was a call to action. I visited a university where his work is still taught. A professor told me Carruthers didn't just write books, he changed the way we think. At an ASCAC youth event, I saw young scholars quoting Carruthers. One said, "He gave us a foundation, now it's our turn to build." Despite all I'd uncovered, I felt there was more to Carruthers' story. What drove him to dedicate his life to this work? What were his doubts, his fears? I sat in my hotel room surrounded by notes. Carruthers wasn't just a scholar, he was a liberator, and his work wasn't finished. Standing in front of his portrait at the Kemetic Institute, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. His legacy wasn't just in books or lectures, it was in the lives he'd touched, including mine.